Hi, I'm Ali Patterson, and in today's episode of the FinTech Show, we cover artificial intelligence and payments, two elements of a bank that are radically changing in a way that even half a decade ago we could not have conceived. With tech companies like IBM having the power of 24,000 personal computers in one through AI, how are banks ever going to compete? With the likes of Amazon and Google looking to dip their toes into the market, particularly on the SME front, banking has never needed to be better. Joining me in the studio, we have Victoria Havisham in Singapore from SmartStream Technologies. SmartStream is a recognized leader in financial transaction management solutions that enables firms to improve operational control and reduce costs. Dialing in from New York, we have Bjorn Austraat, SVP Agile AI for Wells Fargo, who is bringing the thunder when it comes to implementing AI across all lines of their business. And bringing in the payments aspect, we have Bayle from Société Générale. So without further ado, let's hit the ground running.
AI is really becoming part of the business fabric at Wells Fargo. And you know, the era of experimentation and early experiments is over, right? And so now it's all about how do we actually return business value, business results, enhance our customer experience, enhance our compliance stance, our risk stance, and so on through actually applied AI throughout the bank. And we have a fairly large number of projects going on at any one time in all lines of business. So in our commercial and corporate investment bank, in our commercial banking sector, in our retail side, and across the back office and mid office portfolio as well. So AI is certainly a big factor and a big important player within Wells Fargo, and it is being infused into a lot of processes and a lot of projects as sometimes a utility, sometimes as a driver and a leader of transformation.
I'm so glad you said that, because the amount of organizations that are doing a lot of innovation theatre and kind of sprinkling a bit of AI on that is kind of crazy. When it comes to actually being practical and implementing these solutions, is it about obviously lowering risk, lowering bad actors, or is it much more around the customer acquisition and the customer experience side of things?
So it's both, top and bottom line perspectives, essentially. And as you may understand, I can't talk about individual projects, but certainly AI is very dominant, for example, and very active in fraud and fraud prevention, which is great for customers, great for Wells Fargo, as we try to preempt, certain fraudulent activities, which then would obviously improve the customer experience and help us save fraud losses. AI is also very, very active in our compliance and risk stance. We have at any one time a number of projects going on that have to do with helping us better adhere to our regulatory obligations. And the types of AI projects span everything from machine learning, typical machine learning projects, to natural language processing and other facets of AI that are all considered AI. So it's really very diverse. It's a very diverse set of projects. And it spans customer experience, team member experience, fraud prevention, the deposits team, and so on and so forth.
What benefits can be gained from introducing AI into operational controls?
Well, typically with data, we find the challenge is actually mostly about normalization and transformation of messy and low quality data sets as they come into your organization and you need to consume that data. You have to ready that messy data so that a specific tool or a human actually understands it and can manage it. You don't really need to do that at all if you deploy AI in the way we do. We can now take low quality data sets from disparate sources with Air. Air will analyze that and learn the data as it is in its messy format. That's a huge efficiency gain for the application of AI. Using AI when comparing data sets also means technical and business agility. So you can focus on other areas of the business. It's immediate. There aren't any wait times to work on data sets or to test your iterations. And by using AI to validate your assumptions, to compare old and new data sets. You can ensure nothing gets lost or missed. You can also control the decay of data internally as it moves through different systems over time. You can essentially properly control risks, improve transformation and IT projects, and you can optimize your data quality operations. And also the final thing is you can centralize everything within the tool, and all of this leads to lower costs and increased productivity.
Reconciliation and entity resolution, as they call it, right? So making sure that this counterparty is correctly classified, or this transaction has both ends of the, or all 3 or 4 parties that are part of the transaction correctly classified and identified, has been a problem, or has been a big to-do, right, for many large organizations, not just banks. And rules-based systems can do some of this work, right? And robotics process automation was actually very, very strong in those fields early on, when robotics process automation was really the dominant automation technology. And AI is now filling gaps and in perfecting and often working with RPA solutions to make it even better, right? And so within entity resolution and thinking about correctly classifying counterparties and so on, one of the key concepts is that data integrity and velocity and variety, so the big V's of big data, right, are a huge challenge. And with increasing microtransactions and things like that, it is becoming increasingly important to be sure that the counterparty, the ends of the transaction, are correctly identified, that they're not fraudulent. And all of this is done in line with the transaction at very, very short turnaround times. So AI is playing a big role there, often also accessing non-traditional data sources. And where natural language processing comes into play is to be able to read very large data sets in the public domain, or that are provided by third-party data providers, to make sense of a name, for example, right? Because if you have a counterparty and you want to correctly classify their industry, and they're called Acme Inc., but you have some other snippets of information, geolocation, addresses, maybe their website, you can read their website to figure out what they're doing. And one of the very, very interesting applications of AI is to then take all of those different sources and make sense and beyond traditional structured data sources, make sense of an entity, for example. And that is then greatly helpful in reconciling transactions, reconciling counterparties, and so on and so forth. Many machine learning algorithms are able to, much better than rules, deal with very high dimensional space. And what that means in plain English is that when you look at a transaction, for example, you obviously have the amount, the name of the counterparties, the date, and so on and so forth. But then very often there are many hundreds of columns of additional information. The previous amounts, the time of day, and things like that, right? The type of good that was purchased. And so machine learning is really uniquely well suited to then taking this very high dimensional information with hundreds and hundreds of dimensions and mapping it and resolving it much better than a rules-based system can. And so in your example, being able to determine that this must be of this type because of the other 89 dimensions is something that machine learning can do. And we then, in our world, obviously, we monitor performance of models that go live. When we see drift, which is almost always happens, that when you turn a model live, the performance will start to decay over time as the data changes around the model and starts to differ more from the data that it was trained on. We then monitor its performance, and we see how we can tune and maintain the model to make it more and more accurate and retrain it as needed, right? And so a specific example is that COVID clearly very much disrupted a lot of the data environment, right? So transactions suddenly went very differently than they did in pre-COVID days. And cash balances and so on and so forth would rise with the PPP program here in the United States. So it is very important that building a good model is a great start in my mind to be successful with AI, but it's really just a start. And it's I jokingly sometimes say that having a good algorithm or a good model is you're 5% there, and then operationalizing it and monitoring it and retraining it and maintaining it as it is delivering value in the real world is key, because models are very reliant on data. And you have to be very, very careful that you don't suddenly have drift in performance or drift in bias even, right? So that you monitor the model's performance, make sure it stays compliant, make sure it stays accurate, and then update it like any running engine or any running machine. It needs service and maintenance. And in the example of airlines, before COVID, they used to have machine learning models that would predict with extremely high accuracy how many seats would sell, 5-6 months out on a particular flight. And they would know, on a flight from Chicago to New York, we'll have 14 empty seats in March for the flight in October. And then, as you can imagine, with COVID's arrival, all of those calculations went out the window. And those disruptions are, a fact of life. But in a well-run AI organization, you will have processes and patterns in place to deal with that and to assume that data will change, sometimes very disruptively, so that you can either then look at the performance and retrain or do other corrective measures as needed.
It's really the next logical step to sort of truly disrupt ourselves and the market somewhat by removing a lot of the human heavy lifting and replacing as much of it as we can really with AI and machine learning components. Like you say, a number of banks in the press at the moment are cutting headcount and resources. And it would be inaccurate of me to say that our AI solutions don't support that kind of rationalization. But this is really a question for each organization that chooses to adopt AI. They will want to reduce complexities and lower costs and human error risks in their business. And an outcome of that will be less people dedicated to sort of mundane manual data matching activities. That's what we're talking about. But there's no reason individuals can't be reassigned to tasks that focus more on growth and differentiation than basic data matching tasks.
Absolutely. I think that sentiment there of the jobs that the programs bringing in AI will be replacing are the kind of jobs that a lot of people not that keen on doing in the first instance, because it can be quite mundane and in some cases brain numbing.
Yeah, totally agree. This is an area of operational control and efficiency and data management that doesn't always need that sort of level of human effort and interaction and skill set when we're running AI algorithms against each other, which are performing extremely well for sort of basic manual matching. And like I say, with affinity, observational learning, the human intervention piece that you apply to that algorithm just starts to improve it over and over and more and more.
How easy is it for very large organizations to deploy your services such as Air? What's the kind of sort of onboarding process and how simple is it for a big bank?
Yeah, it's very easy. We enable large institutions even to go live on the same day if need be. It's a software as a service product, so it's a web-based application. You can be anywhere in the world to use it. We just set up the security permissions. We give access to the users. We can automate the data submissions going into the application, or you can just manually drag and drop in your files. But you're ready to get started immediately. There's no upfront implementation project whatsoever. Depending on the initial level of investment, actually 9 times out of 10, you're likely to get return on investment potentially in your first week when you're using AI in this way, because there's a step change that we're representing through certain processes that take weeks and months. We're measuring them in just minutes. And also, I wanted to mention that software as a service subscription pricing models for large institutions make total cost of ownership very transparent and controllable, which is really important. We also run a continuous innovation model, so we can deploy new features every 8 weeks. So it's easy to get started, and it's easy to keep innovating as time goes on.
It did seem that 10, 20 years ago, banks loved to have an on-prem data center. They loved to write down who had keys to the server room and their own in-house team of developers. But now, through the likes of Wells Fargo's Innovation Center, you're now part of that forest, that ecosystem. Where do you see your role within this ecosystem, within this marketplace?
Sure. So it is critically important for highly regulated enterprises like a large bank like Wells Fargo to have core competency, because partnering is great and it's important. And we have an active incubator and ecosystem about attracting the right innovative thinking, right, of smaller players, fintechs, and so on. But it's also really important for a highly regulated bank to have a core competency within AI, within machine learning, So we have a pretty substantial data science team, but also a very robust validation team, right? So our model governance and risk team that makes sure that the models are compliant, that the data use is compliant, that we're not using data inappropriately, and it's always a fit for purpose inspection, right? So some data may be okay to use for a marketing model, but not credit underwriting, for example. So having competency inside or within a lot of these different areas is critical. And it's also very important to have that because we are not able to, nor would we want to, take a third-party model sight unseen and just use it, right? So let's say we had a partner helps us determine whether or not to issue a mortgage. It would be absolutely essential, and it is essential, and we do this, to make sure we validate that third-party model, and we have to have the competency to do that. And to validate third-party models, it requires even a higher level of skill than just writing a model, right? You have to then also be really knowledgeable in being able to inspect and think about machine learning on a very, very high level. So core competency, it's not a matter of throwing it over the fence and just saying, I'm going to use a specialist partner. It's not okay in regulated industries. So you have to blend it, but you also want to tap into the innovative spirit and capability of a very large third-party ecosystem, right? Both partners that live within your own incubator, and other large partners. So we partner, of course, with many other large financial institutions when it comes to preventing fraud, for example, right? So yeah, absolutely, open innovation is key. At the same time, abdication is not okay, right? So you cannot just say, oh, I'm just going to outsource all of this, because then you cannot stand up to the regulator and say with good conscience that you did everything you could to make sure that the AI that is running and working on your customer data is fair, it's unbiased, it's robust, right? The models themselves are robust. And in recent years, one of the emerging hot topics in AI is adversarial robustness, meaning machine learning models can be attacked like any other piece of software. And bad actors are attacking the machine learning algorithms to try to reverse engineer the training data, or to trick self-driving cars into believing that a stop sign is a yield sign and things like that, right? So having good competency in model fairness, robustness, and in the entire model ops lifecycle is absolutely key. And we certainly try to cover those bases rigorously, right, throughout the life cycle. And one of the things that I would add to that is that the data science piece and the robustness and capabilities there do need to be complemented by kind of the business of AI, or the pragmatics of AI piece. Very, very key, right? And overlooking that and having having a function that can actually interpret and mediate between the business demands and needs and the capabilities of AI is very key in my mind, because it's those teams often speak different languages, right? So if you have ever listened to some very, very highly educated data scientists or experts of any field, right? Of course, they develop their own language, right? Their own jargon. And engineeringese and data sciencese is quite different from businessese and strategic thinking, right? Strategic business planning. So having a group that can bridge that gap, I find, is very key. You can think of them as like interpreters, right? And in my distant past, my very, very first job, many, many years ago in Austria, I was actually an interpreter. I was an interpreter working at conferences at the United Nations and a translator. And back then I helped people understand each other across English, German, and Spanish language and cultural boundaries. Today, I jokingly sometimes say I have the same job, just now it's executivese and engineeringese and data sciencese. And those languages and cultures are also quite different. And being able to tie them together and get them aligned and balanced and moving in the same direction is very, very essential to be successful in a large company, to do AI that actually works and performs work output, is business impactful, and becomes ultimately a natural fabric of business where it's, ideally AI is actually invisible, right? It's like electricity. It just works, it just does the work, right? So the outcome of AI is the beneficial thing. But just like you don't want to see the electricity as sparks in your apartment, you just want to see the work output, the toast that was toasted or the light that comes on. AI similarly, as we move into the really industrialization phase of AI, should become a background utility that just does work, it's useful, and people assume is there. And it's of course highly regulated and well organized to ensure nothing bad happens, right? So that's the glue code almost between the business need all the way through the outcome of AI, is where having that entire value chain is when AI really works. And many companies, I think, when they started doing AI in the Wild West days of AI 10 years ago, they had a lot of disjointed science experiments, but that whole capability end to end is something that grows over time. And it takes a while to develop the organizational muscle memory to actually do it end to end.
This may seem a little bit strange, but I always find it kind of nuts that 20 years ago, on the retail side of payments, banks basically ran everything at the end of the day or at the end of the week in batches, and now everything is like that. I also think back to Victorian England, where scientists said there is nothing left to discover. Is there, now that we're entering this world of real time, and for example, you guys at SocGen, you don't really do retail batch payments anymore. Do you think that there's any challenges left to solve when it comes to actually payments processing? What's still on the to-do list if we're into this world of instant, safe, real-time payments?
So I still think, I was not born during the Victorian period, so I can't comment on the discovery or not. But I still think that things are, I don't know if we are going to discover, but we're certainly going to evolve. Okay, that's for sure. If you think about, if I just make a comparison with a phone, okay, not so long ago, and I was born, mobile phone did not exist. You were working at your work, you had your phone from your work, you were out of work, you had no contact with anyone. And then today, it's very difficult to imagine your life without a mobile phone. Not being able to be called anywhere, anytime, to be able to look at the news, etc. And I think it's going to be the same thing for payments. Yes, there is a legacy system across all banks. Yes, banks have themselves legacy IT systems that they need to update, upgrade, or adapt thanks to, I would say, third-party providers on plugging new applications, etc. But I still believe that the payment experience will evolve to become much more real-time, much more frictionless. And at one point, making a payment will be as simple as what we do with faster payment in the UK, but everywhere in the world. So it's going to evolve, it's going to keep happening, but don't forget that you don't have only banks that are concerned. In Asia, and in China in particular, you have plenty of web companies that are offering payment services. WeChat, etc., they are offering payment services. So actually, at the moment, the competition is not so much between banks, it's more between banks and these new entrants that are offering payment capabilities without the need to have a bank account sometimes. The key element here is, again, customer experience, okay? I think all banks today are thinking about customer experience. What can we do? What should we do to improve the customer experience of our corporate and retail customers? Okay, so that's the key thought. The second thing is banks realize now that they are not software companies. So when, not so long ago, as you said it, banks had the tendency to develop everything in-house because they didn't want to rely on a third party or add some internal decision process, etc. Today, there's more and more opening to third-party providers that are software companies and that are dedicated to producing, I would say, specific applications to provide specific services that are going to complement the bank activity of doing payments. Okay, so this is important.
Well, that's all we've got time for on today's episode of the FinTech Show. Thanks to all my guests for joining the discussion today, and to you, our viewers at home. Bye for now.